to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
Hello, Mind Escapees. If you have not already, please go check out my other channel, Masters of Rhetoric. I will have the link down below. It's also part of the Mind Escape LinkTree link. It's something I'm very passionate about, where I dissect the origins of Western thought through the pre-Socratic thinkers, all the way to Aristotle, and I'm probably going to go beyond that as well at some point. But right now I'm focused on the Ionian physicists all the way to Aristotle. So please support Masters of Rhetoric. Go check out our YouTube channel and subscribe. There's tons of shorts on there already, as well as episodes. And there's a bunch of episodes lined up. I'm on all audio platforms with it. And if you're on TikTok, Instagram, X, or any of the social media platforms, please go check out our page on there as well. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Tonight we have a special episode. This is somebody who's been on the show a handful of times in the past, and has even been featured in our documentary, As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. He's a really, really interesting guy, super intelligent, and he has a new book out called Death by Astonishment, which I really, really enjoyed. Of course, I'm speaking about Dr. Andrew Gallimore. Dr. Andrew Gallimore is a computational neurobiologist, pharmacologist, chemist, and writer who has been interested in the neural basis of psychedelic drug action for many years, and is the author of a number of research papers on the powerful psychedelic drug N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, and its effects on the brain and consciousness. In 2015, he collaborated with DMT pioneer Dr. Rick Strassman, author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, to develop a pharmacokinetic model of DMT as the basis of a target-controlled intravenous infusion protocol for extended journeys in the bizarre worlds to which DMT gates access. His current interests focus on DMT and other psychedelic molecules as tools for gathering access to otherwise inaccessible subjective worlds, their neuroscientific underpinning, and their possible ontological and metaphysical implications. He currently lives and works in Tokyo. We've had both Andrew Gallimore and Dr. Rick Strassman on the show many times, and both always bring the fire and the knowledge, and I love talking to both of them and picking their brains on these topics. So please hit that like and subscribe button, and if you enjoy this episode, we have many more available on our YouTube channel, Spotify, and all audio platforms, as well as a Patreon page with many archived episodes on there as well. So please click the LinkTree link down below. Here we go. Welcome back on Mind Escape, Andrew. It's been a few years. I really enjoyed your new book, Death by Astonishment, and I have a couple of old favorites here as well. I actually did the audio book or Audible for Death by Astonishment, so I don't have the physical copy, but I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you reading your own book as well.
Yeah, I insisted upon that. The publisher wanted to bring in an actor at first with a British accent. I said no, I'll do it. Because I live in Tokyo, it's a bit tricky to navigate. So they wanted to do it in the studio in New York, but I said no, we'll do it by remote, whatever it takes. So they sent all the equipment to me and covered my room with foam and stuff like that, just to be able to do it myself. So I think it turned out well in the end.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. And, they're obviously reading something like the physical copy, there's something to that. But I also think that there's something to listening to it as well. And like I said, I really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. But yeah, it's been a few years since we've had you on. We've had you on a handful of times in the past. We even included you in the documentary we made, which I'll put a link there too if anybody wants to check that out. But I just want to kind of jump right in, if that's okay. So the early explorers like Richard Spruce searched for the plants such as the copy vine, and he documented harmine and harmaline, but it took a lot longer to connect the brew, or I should say the DMT containing elements and alkaloids to the brew, because it was just kind of, I guess, people were looking at it from the perspective of the MAOI.
Yeah, I mean, well, Richard Spruce, he discovered, well, at least discovered's a strong word. I mean, he discovered from the Western scientific perspective, at least, the carpi vine. He named it Banisteriopsis carpi. And as far as he was concerned, when he first drank the brew and was shown where this vine was growing, this key vegetal component of this ayahuasca brew, or carpi, as it was known in that area of the Amazon, it was assumed for the next 100 years that there was going to be some alkaloid in the carpi vine that gave it its visionary powers. It was assumed that it would be as simple as that if they were able to extract an alkaloid from the carpi vine, inject this alkaloid into people, then they would have experienced the same effects as ayahuasca. But it didn't work out. We know, in hindsight, we know exactly why it didn't work out. But you have to imagine this was, Spruce discovered the carpi vine and named it in 1852. It wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century, so over 50 years later, that the alkaloid, which went by many names. Telepethine was the first name given to it, banisterine, etc., etc. And various groups attempted to recreate the effects of ayahuasca by giving people this alkaloid, which we now know, which was then discovered a few years later to be identical to an already well-known set of alkaloids, the harmala alkaloids, which came from Peganum harmala, this medicinal shrub, which was perfectly well known. So it was kind of like, this doesn't really make any sense, because these alkaloids, when you isolate them, they make people a bit dizzy, kind of drunken appearing. They feel a bit drowsy. They fall asleep. They might have some colorful but fairly unremarkable dreams, and that's about it. And so it didn't seem to match these fantastical reports that Spruce had heard. I mean, he'd heard about people traveling to other worlds and seeing, beautiful cities and savage beasts preparing to seize them, from one report. I mean, it was wild stuff, and he'd never seen anything like it or heard about anything like it. And so it was kind of like, scientists hit a dead end when they couldn't work out why they couldn't recreate these extraordinary visionary effects by injecting people with the alkaloids isolated from this very vine that Spruce had first identified and named. And that dragged on until really the middle of the 20th century. Richard Shultes, or Shultes, the world's most famous and important ethnobotanist, he was very interested in the world's leading expert on ayahuasca. But he was struggling as much as anyone, partly because when he spoke to indigenous groups that were making ayahuasca, which went by dozens of different names depending on who you spoke to, and there were dozens of different recipes. So they all contained the carpi vine, Banisteriopsis carpi, the ayahuasca vine, but then they also contained often dozens. There was I think there's more than 100 different plants have been documented used in ayahuasca. So it was a Herculean task to try and work out what the hell was going on. And it wasn't really until William Burroughs, the novelist, trekked into the Colombian rainforest with the aim of finding out about this drug that he'd read about in this magazine, Yahe, which was described as the world's most powerful psychedelic, and he went into the jungle to find it, and he found it. And he had several kind of fairly unimpressive experiences, probably just as infusions of the carpi vine alone. And then finally, he was led into this trade secret by this shaman called Saboya, who told him that we use the carpi vine, but there is this other secret ingredient, another leaf, a leaf rather than the vine. There was this leaf from this other plant, which was essential, an essential catalyzing component is how Burroughs described it. And he sent these leaves to Richard Shultes and said, I think this could be important. I think this could be the key. This is why the experiments have failed before, is because you're concentrating only on the Harmala alkaloids, whereas there needs to be this other plant. Maybe this other plant contains some other chemical that's really important here. Richard Shultes ignored his letter, and he never replied to William Burroughs, but he did keep the letter and the leaves. And then it was, I think, more than a decade later when Richard Shultes' one of his graduate students, a guy called Homer Pinkley, was in the rainforest, I think in Ecuador, but my memory might fail me here. And he was invited to an ayahuasca ceremony. He observed the brew being made, and the following morning he kind of rooted around in the cauldron that was used to make the brew, and he found a few leaves that had escaped the boiling intact and some seeds. And he was able to make a formal identification of this plant, which they call oprito, which means little heavenly men, which is kind of a clue in there, perhaps, knowing what we know about DMT now. And he identified it as Psychotria viridis, also known as chacruna. The leaves were sent for chemical analysis, and they were found to contain DMT and basically nothing else. So this was the first clue. Richard Shultes then went back to Burroughs' letter that he'd written more than a decade earlier and found that actually Burroughs had indeed collected the same leaf that his graduate student would later identify. So really, William Burroughs should be given the credit for discovering the important DMT containing component of ayahuasca. But even that wasn't the end of the story, of course, is because just a couple of years before that discovery, or a few years before that discovery, Stephen Zara, who discovered the psychedelic properties of DMT, the Hungarian physician, he had worked out by swallowing large amounts of pure DMT that it's not orally active. So it didn't make any sense. Still, the story didn't make any sense, because why would you have this visionary drink containing a DMT containing plant which is completely inactive orally? And what the hell is this carpi vine doing in there anyway? Why is that there? And so it took, again, more research of the kind of pharmacological properties of the Harmala alkaloids, because the Harmala alkaloids are being studied as a treatment for Parkinson's disease. And it was discovered, observed that the Harmala alkaloids are very powerful inhibitors of this enzyme that's found in the gut, but also throughout the body, monoamine oxidase. This family of enzymes. And so it was kind of the hypothesis that developed from this was that, maybe the Harmala alkaloids in the vine are inhibiting the monoamine oxidase enzymes, which we knew are important for metabolizing amines, which includes tryptamines, and which of course includes DMT. So that was the first. That was kind of the eureka moment, that's maybe how it worked. And then it took more work, and eventually Dennis McKenna, Terence's brother, acquired a sample of pure raw ayahuasca brew made for him by an indigenous group in the Amazon, and was able to isolate harmine and harmaline and demonstrate that the ayahuasca brew was an inhibitor of monoamine oxidase. And from then, there were kind of human studies where people were swallowing Harmala alkaloids and DMT, on their own and together, and demonstrating finally that this so-called ayahuasca effect was was responsible for the visionary effects of ayahuasca. So there we go. There's the history of ayahuasca.
That was a good summary there. Reading the first few chapters, it is kind of frustrating. It's like how are you not figuring this out? But you're not really taking into the context the time, how hard it is to get to some of these locations, and probably the unwillingness of the indigenous people to really open up on that end of things. My question is, though, so you mentioned William Burroughs, you mentioned Homer Pinkley and Richard Shultes. It seemed like they were doing these MAOI brews, but never getting the DMT. Were they doing it on their own? Because I know the William Burroughs, you describe an anecdote where he gets mad at the shaman or whoever was brewing it for him and thought that he was kind of like messing with him or something like that.
Drunken fuck of a witch doctor.
Yeah. So like, were they doing this on their own, or were they getting it from some indigenous people and just not getting the full picture? Like, what was going on there? Because I know that there's different varieties of concoctions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there are some groups that still use, I say still use, the assumption being that the original ayahuasca brew would have been the carpi vine and the carpi vine alone. And Burroughs was searching for the vine, and he acquired the vine, and then he was looking for people to make the brew with the vine. Basically, he assumed, as everyone else did, that the vine was the key component here, and that he just needed someone to prepare the brew, to prepare the infusion, the decoction, and that's what he did. Whether these were reputable ayahuasqueros or shamans is an open question here. We don't really know. All we know is that his first few attempts were kind of nauseating. He vomited and he passed out, and he was extremely paranoid. He was extremely suspicious, even contemptuous, one would say, of these shamans. He didn't believe that they had secrets or special techniques or anything. He just thought that they were boiling up this vine in water and charging him a fee, which was normally like a bottle of extremely strong spirits. I mean, these are I don't know the kind of shamans that he was dealing with, and he tried to make it himself as well using the vine, and he failed. So yeah, that's and it wasn't until he found this other shaman that did have the secret, who was using it turns out was using the chacruna as well as the carpi vine.
What about Shultes, who's an ethnobotanist? He probably would have had more, I guess, of a history to get in with these indigenous tribes. How was he not able to kind of have luck with it, if you will?
Well, I think the issue was that nobody knew what the function of the harmala alkaloids was. Nobody knew what the harmala alkaloids did pharmacologically. So the carpi vine was just one component of a mixture. It was just a drug mixture, as far as anyone could. Making the pharmacological connection, right? That this is a pharmacological synergy and how it works, that requires an understanding of the underlying chemical pharmacology, which no one understood. So Shultes was doing lots of important work in documenting the different types of plants that were being put into this brew, but the idea of this minimal binary decoction, this essential two components, the carpi vine and the DMT containing plant, which might be chacruna, it might be chakrapanga, was another one from Banisteriopsis rusbiana, although that's disputed. But anyway, but another DMT containing plant. So there was no indication that there was something special going on, so to speak. It was just a visionary drink that was made from one plant and plus often many other different types of plants, tobacco and other plants containing tropane alkaloids. So it's not surprising that some of these decoctions were very, very visionary. But yeah, the underlying pharmacology that everyone knows now, everyone who knows about ayahuasca will tell you happily and knowingly about MAO inhibitors and stuff. But at the time, this was new. This wasn't known. It wasn't known. I think it was the 1950s when monoamine oxidase was first discovered as this enzyme, this group of enzymes that are important in amine metabolism, particularly tryptamine metabolism. So nobody had any possibility. Doesn't matter how smart you were, it would have been impossible for you or I or anyone else working in the 1940s and early 50s to have worked out what was going on.
Yeah, I guess hindsight's always easier to figure these things out. But I was just saying from like a curiosity standpoint, if Shultes was studying these tribes and stuff, I would have thought that maybe he'd either sit in or watch kind of what was going on and just, observe from that standpoint. It's
absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't know.
He did, and there are accounts, particularly in Wade Davis has a wonderful book, One River, where it's basically a biography really of Richard Shultes. And he describes his experiences. That people used to say that if there's a psychedelic drug that Richard Shultes hasn't taken, it's because it hasn't yet been discovered. So, I mean, he wasn't just documenting. He wasn't just like a botanist who was documenting and naming or whatever these plants, but he was taking them. He was taking these drugs. He always tried the drugs that he discovered. And that included ayahuasca. And he had actually come across Chakrapanga several years before, like I think almost 16 years before Homer Pinkley discovered chacruna. But again, the chemical analysis wasn't done. But even if it had have been done and they'd found DMT in there, at the time, this would have been prior to people knowing what DMT did. I mean, DMT's psychedelic effects weren't discovered until 1956. So all of these things are kind of happening at the same time. The discovery of the psychedelic effects of DMT, the discovery of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the discovery of chacruna, is all within like a decade. All these things came together, like a confluence of these different research outcomes, which then led to, within a decade, kind of the first ayahuasca effect hypothesis.
I was really happy that you talked about Virola in there as well, because I remember reading True Hallucinations and listening to Dennis McKenna talk about how they were looking for this Virola paste, this like orally active paste. And on the way they end up finding mushrooms, and that's where the story goes with that. But can you describe where Virola paste is used, and is it still used? Because you don't really hear much about it. It's kind of one of those like I don't know. Like I said, I'm glad you mentioned it because I don't really hear too many people talking about it.
Yeah. So the Virola. So the Virola is simply a particular genus of tree that occurs widely throughout the Amazon, and there are a number of groups. The Witoto is a good example. So when Richard Shultes is credited, I think rightly so, with discovering these Virola snuffs. Epenia is the one that you will most hear about. But there are many different Virola snuffs that are made with the bark of these Virola trees, or specifically the resin. So you peel the bark off the Virola tree, and then you get this resin that beads, and then you basically, not dissimilar to ayahuasca, you boil this bark up and all of the resin is extracted into the water, and then you boil it off until it forms a paste, and then you dry it in the sun until it's completely dry, and then you can break it up and form a fine powder, and it looks kind of similar to cinnamon or paprika or something like this. Then it's used as a snuff, and Virola contains high concentrations of so these Apena snuffs contain high concentrations of tryptamines, including DMT, but also sometimes 5-MeO-DMT, 5-hydroxy-DMT, i.e. bufotenine. And interestingly, there are also kind of a mysterious form of Virola, not a snuff, but a pellet. This is something, again, that Richard Shultes discovered, was that some groups were making, rather than drying out the resin and forming a powder, they were actually forming little pellets that they swallowed. Now, as soon as I tell you that, you should be thinking, wait a minute, if they're swallowing this, there has to be some kind of monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and that isn't known. So that's kind of a mystery, actually. I don't talk about in the book because it would lead me down the garden path a little bit into thinking about.
It's the next book, right?
Still, yes, the next book. But yeah, there are pellets. So there's oral forms, and these oral hallucinogens, as Shultes described them, which are these pellets made from Virola resin. But the question is obvious there, is that why are these active? Is there some monoamine oxidase inhibitor within the bark? If so, I've not seen analyses that would suggest that. Are there admixtures? We know that the other major snuff variety, principally from the yopo tree, Anadenanthera peregrina, so this produces the yopo snuff. This is from the seeds, and these seeds are ground up again to form a snuff, and these are inhaled. Or normally you would have a partner, one with you would put the snuff into a long tube, up to a teaspoon of this snuff, quite a lot of it would go into one end of the tube, and then your partner would blow it forcefully into your nostrils, and it kind of explodes into your head, and it's very unpleasant. It's not surprising, it's not particularly popular in the West. But analyses of these snuffs, again, find DMT, sometimes 5-MeO-DMT, bufotenine, but also harmala alkaloids in some analyses. Again, analyses vary. You've got a tree that grows over broad areas of Amazonia and the Orinoco Plains, and you get different subspecies or variants that contain an alkaloid concentration and changes over time and throughout the season and growing stage and all this kind of stuff. But also admixture plants that could be added as well. That we know there are certain admixture plants that are added to these yopo snuffs. It's not just the seeds, but the presence of these harmala alkaloids within this yopo snuff suggests again that these indigenous peoples are perhaps employing pharmacological synergy to enhance the effects of the snuff. Richard Spruce, way back in 1852, 53, 54, he was wandering the Orinoco Plains, and he came across this man from a tribe called the Guaibo, who had a pouch of this yopo snuff, but he also had a piece of carpi vine hanging around his neck, which he used to chew. And he told Spruce that when you combine the yopo snuff and the vine together, you chew a bit on the vine, take a bit of yopo snuff, that it kind of enhances the visions. And there are groups that will drink a ayahuasca, so-called, or carpi brew with the vine alone, and then take the snuff. So that rather than having the DMT and the harmala alkaloids within the drink, they have just the harmala alkaloids in the drink, which they drink first, and then they take the snuff, and this, as they understand it, and they experience it, this enhances the vision. So this pharmacological synergy is not isolated, and doesn't seem to even be isolated to the same to ayahuasca, but also is used to enhance epena, possibly, and certainly yopo as well. So these are sophisticated, I describe them in the book. These aren't just plant-based drug preparations. These are true pharmacological technologies that were developed without an underlying, an understanding of the underlying pharmacology, for sure, but that were highly sophisticated technologies, pharmacological technologies that were developed perhaps over hundreds of years, for the sole purpose of allowing these people to communicate and interact with and form relationships with these normally hidden beings that they can only see by using these various plant-based drug technologies.
Yeah, that was a interesting part too. I mean, I've heard of Yopo, but when you're describing it, the like shotgun method, and the one guy, that gets the hit, all of a sudden he's bleeding out of his nose, he's barfing. It just sounds terrible, right? Like it does not sound
Yeah.
like a fun time. I mean, maybe afterwards, maybe the DMT once it hits, takes you and you don't really think about it. I don't know, but I want to talk about the quote little people now. The little people motif or machine elf like beings, or they show up in multiple traditions. Do you think these consistent motifs reflect like and I know that's kind of like the whole background behind your theories on this, but do you think that shared vision and experience and realms and everything, do you think that speaks to the tradition and the culture? Like if the little people that they were seeing on ayahuasca and before Western ethnobotanists and people came over, do you think that those are similar to ones that we're seeing now, or do you think they're completely different?
The short answer is I don't know. We can only go from their descriptions. Now, there are some good, the most detailed descriptions of these beings. So first of all, these beings, as you said, there are many groups that describe encounters with so-called little people. That go by specific names. They wouldn't necessarily call them little people, but they're described as small, sometimes humanoid, sometimes not, beings that operate in great numbers, that are colorful and bright and dance and sing. They're very lively and very jovial. And to me, that's the DMT elf motif. When people describe now, what are the unifying characteristics? I always say the machine elves or DMT elves or whatever you want to call them, they come in a variety of forms, but they're unified by their character. So we can't say everyone's seeing exactly the same form of beings, but they all seem to have this same kind of character. They're jovial, they're cheeky, there's lots of them, they like to dance around. So to me, when I read of Yanomami shamans describing seeing these multitudinous beings with colored headdresses dancing and singing and operating in such great numbers that you can never get to the end of them, to me they're describing the same thing. Right, that's the same, but just by a different name. They call them the hekura, but to me that's just another name for what we would describe as a machine elf, or what other people might describe as pixies or fairies or whatever. I think you're talking about the same kind of. Is it the same ultimately? We don't know, but it's certainly it's a recurring motif that is not modern. It's not a Terence McKennaism. Yes, he popularized it, but this thing goes back, much, far before McKenna. It goes back to the first DMT studies in the 1950s, and as you say, all the way through back various types of indigenous peoples that use tryptamine-based drugs. Mark Plotkin, who was one of Shultes, is another one of, I think he was one of his students. He took the Apenia snuff, so this Virola snuff, for the first time with a shaman, and he suddenly started seeing, in the corner of his vision, he started seeing these beings, these lively dancing beings that became more and more lively and more of them. And he asked the shaman and said, what are these small men that I'm seeing? And the shaman responded instantaneously and said, well, these are the hekura, the spirits of the forest, of course, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. So yeah, I do find that intriguing, to say the least, that you have these groups going back in entirely different parts of the world and from entirely different backgrounds, entirely different cultures, entirely different world views, religious and mystical traditions, and yet they're all describing multitudinous, giggling, lively beings that we would call elves, but they have other names for.
Yeah, the reason why I ask too is I've talked with a few people. One guy never really looked into anything from, ancient Mexico or Central America, and he said that the first time he did DMT, he was seeing all sorts of like Mayan symbolism and stuff like that. And I've heard another person similar experience, but with like Egyptian stuff. And I was just curious if you thought that maybe when our consciousness evolves, whatever that archetype or culture currently is what's reflective in that experience in that moment, or maybe that's where some of that culture comes from, is these altered states that then they bring into their culture and integrate it, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, if you look at the imagery of Southern American peyote, peyote traditions, I mean, a lot of their clothing and their art, I mean, this is clearly comes from peyote vision, so that clearly happens. And I think the DMT experience to me it seems to transcend culture in many ways. It seems to operate orthogonally to the current culture. Some would disagree on that, but I think it feels more likely, and again, I'm just speculating, that this is something that would be brought into a culture and would influence the culture and the kind of imagery that's left behind by certain cultures, rather than them producing the imagery and then seeing the same things in their vision. It makes sense in the opposite direction, that if they're having visionary experiences and seeing certain types of imagery, that would form the basis, perhaps of their religious traditions. I mean, certainly, in amongst the indigenous peoples of Amazonia, that is the entire basis of their religious mystical traditions, and the stories of the spirits comes largely from ingesting these powerful psychedelic drugs. Which came first? Were they somehow aware of these beings prior to, and they developed the technologies in order to see them more clearly and gain access to them more readily? Or I imagine actually it's more of kind of these things operating in tandem in some way. I don't think it's as simple as, they took a drug accidentally or something and saw visions and then decided, these must be gods. I think it's more like something deeper and stranger is going on that perhaps as a modern Westerner is beyond my ability to comprehend.
Interesting. Yeah, and you could look at even what you're doing, with the building alien worlds, and from your standpoint, you have all this knowledge now. You're a neuroscientist. You understand how these compounds work and how they interact with your body and receptors and everything. And we're talking about aliens and future and technology. So it's kind of a different thing altogether now, as where do you think somebody in the ancient world using these compounds, I don't even think they could comprehend something like that. So I do think that culture does inform our idea of what's going on to some degree.
Yes. I mean, certainly our interpretation and the implications of what this means, it absolutely has to be influenced by culture. I mean, you're right. They could never have imagined, for example, people will smoke DMT and say, this is clear evidence that we're living in some kind of simulation, and that's some kind of computer program that's been encoded by some alien intelligence. And this is an idea actually that I develop in great detail in Alien Information Theory, my first book. It's not a belief system I'd adhere to in any way at all, by the way, as I've said 1,000 times, but no one listens. But of course, Amazonian peoples, 1,000 years ago, whatever, couldn't even imagine such a thing. Does that mean that we're approaching truth in some way, or are we merely reaching for what appears to be the most appropriate cultural tool to explain this? I think in the end, I always say in the end, the Amazonian worldview, I say Amazonian, South American indigenous people's worldview here, that they're interacting with the spirit world, and perhaps my interpretation that we're interacting with some kind of intelligent agent, some kind of discarnate intelligence, the nature and origin of which I don't know anything about. I think ultimately, if you look, these things are basically the same. I'm describing the same thing from two different perspectives. Whereas, if someone talks about a spirit, what's a spirit? It's a discarnate being. It's an intelligent being of some sort that doesn't occupy a carnate form. It's not embodied. It's a disembodied being of some sort. My modern, less loaded, more neutral term for this, and a discarnate intelligent agent. I'm describing the same thing, really. I don't think I'm saying anything different. I'm simply using my modern kind of neuroscientific perspective to try and understand the nature, I guess, of these intelligences, and to try and convince people that it's worthwhile to actually take them seriously, and that we shouldn't be simply dismissing these beliefs of the so-called savage and uncivilized as being superstitions and nonsense, or just hallucinations. And I think that's really the aim of the book, I guess, is not to tell people what DMT is or what DMT represents, but to convince people that there is something extremely strange and extremely difficult to explain with DMT. I'm not sure if I answered the question there.
That was good. No, you're good. Rambling's also good sometimes too. It's you got to riff a little bit to get something out there.
Riff a little bit. That's the word, not ramble. Ramble's a bad word.
So a common idea, or like a way people try and parse out what's going on in these states, is this idea of a filter, or some sort of perceptional filter when you're under any sort of psychedelic, really, but more of the 5-HT2A, or tryptamines. But when you look at that model, is that useful, or do you think it hinders progress? Like, where do you currently stand on that idea of this idea of a filter?
I think it's useful. I mean, the idea of a filter really can be traced, really should be credited to Aldous Huxley. I mean, he described this idea that psychedelics open the doors of perception, his most famous phrase, right? And he described this idea that you have this, so he called it a reducing valve, that effectively filters out all but a measly trickle of information that's important and useful to survival. It's broadly valid, I think, but Aldous Huxley was working in a time where we didn't understand the neural mechanisms. We now kind of understand how that filter works and how it doesn't work. It's one thing to say, oh, the brain is a filter, but then you have to say, well, how does this filtering work, and why would psychedelics disrupt this filter? We kind of understand how they do now, because we know that the world that your brain is constructing is this model, and this model is constantly attempting to predict and filter out, to extinguish sensory inputs. Sensory stimulation is constantly entering the brain, and the role of this model, what the brain does, is basically try to predict what these sensory inputs are going to be. And if the model is correct, the predictions are correct, then it extinguishes, it cancels out. There's literally neural information coming down this cortical hierarchy towards the visual cortex, and it's literally cancelling out the information that's coming into the brain. If it gets it right, if it misses, makes a wrong prediction, then that information goes into the brain and must be processed. It's unpredicted. It's a prediction error. So the brain is constantly trying to make these predictions about sensory inputs, and that's how the filter works. It's like process. You can imagine trying to work out, where's this information coming from, and then cancelling it out, because that's cheaper to do that rather than to kind of process all sensory inputs, even sensory inputs that you already kind of know about. If your model is working, then you don't kind of need to know. Really, you don't need much sensory inputs. If your model of the world and what's going on in the world seems to be functioning, then you don't need much sensory inputs. And so that's the idea. That's the filter. Now, when psychedelics bind to the 5-HT2A receptor, they stimulate neurons. These are excitatory receptors. They stimulate neurons. They make them more excitable. They make them more likely to fire. And so you get this highly excitable cortex where information is flowing much more rapidly and more readily. So the model, this world model that's constructed by the cortex, is disrupted. It becomes far less stable. It's nudged towards the chaotic realm. It becomes much more complex. It becomes much more unstable, fluid, dynamic, a little bit more random, sort of entropic, as Robin Carhart-Harris would call it. And it becomes much worse making predictions. So the model stops functioning as a valid kind of predictor, which means more information makes it past these kind of inhibitory predictions that are coming down the cortical hierarchy, and so more information gets through. And you've lost the filter. The filter is this prediction system. So when you disrupt that prediction system, more information comes in. So yes, the filter model works, but now we kind of understand, at least to a certain extent, at least we have a good working model of how that filter works, and indeed how psychedelics disrupt that filter.
Yeah, I think maybe it was 2 or 3 times ago when you were on, we went in depth about kind of the hierarchy of the idea of the filter between like tryptamines versus tropanes, and even like alcohol. People can hallucinate on alcohol. Doesn't mean you're actually seeing anything important, right? So, and
Right.
I think you pointed out too, because I think we were also talking about salvia and the GABA opioid receptors and different things like that, and how even those are different too, and they use different parts of the brain and stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of weirdness there. I think if anybody's interested in that, like I said, we riffed on that for a while, one episode a few times back. But if DMT experiences involve genuinely informative perception beyond personal symbolism, which is kind of what we were just talking about, what kinds of experiments or cross checks could you or like what would convince you in that regard? Or like, is there like an experiment or something that you could feel validated on that end of things?
I think so. There are a number of experiments one can devise here. The classic one, which you might have spoken about before, comes from a paper by a guy called Rodriguez back in 2005, maybe, a long time ago. Whereas he suggested, he said, look, if these are intelligent beings we're interacting with, I mean, that's really what we want to know. Is you want to know, are we interacting with some kind of intelligence here? Is this not just a projection of my own mind, whatever that might mean, or are we dealing with some kind of external intelligence that is non-human? And if so, how do we demonstrate that fact, that possibility? And he suggested, this Rodriguez, that, well, we give these beings mathematical problems to solve, right? We give them a large number and say, give me the unique prime factors of this large number. All numbers have a set of unique prime factors, but they're very difficult, certainly with large numbers, to calculate in your head. Well, they're impossible, basically, for a human to work out what these numbers are, this set of prime factors in your head of a large number. So you send someone into the DMT space with this large number, which is very easy to remember, maybe a 4-digit number or something. And then you ask the entities, hey, here's this 4-digit number, what are the unique prime factors? And then the idea being that, assuming they're cooperative, that they will go, it's this, 7 and 13 and whatever. The issue with that, of course, is that there's this assumption that they're going to be cooperative. There's something a little bit. There's a shade of arrogance implicit in the whole thing, that we're going in there and saying, "Hey, prove your ontological status. We don't believe that you're real. Prove that you're real." And if they are some kind of intelligence that is orders of magnitude beyond the human, so far beyond the human that it's incomprehensible to the human, they're going to think, "Oh, fuck off." I mean, who are you exactly? And they're more likely to kind of fuck with us, I would say. So I'm a little bit, and there are other experiments that one can imagine. Sending two different people into the DMT space at the same time and asking, trying to look for at least correlations or parallels in terms of their
Dr.
experience.
David Luke do that? I think actually something, maybe the Dreaming Jaguars. I remember them talking about something along those lines a while back about trying to connect in that space or getting data. I thought David Luke was doing something like that.
He might be. I'm not sure it's actually being done. I mean, we've been talking about this kind of thing for a long time. It wouldn't be a necessarily difficult thing to do. The experiment needs to be well designed, and the problem is, as David Luke will always tell you, is that if you send two people into the DMT space at the same time and get some kind of information share between them, that's basically it's a test of telepathy with extra steps. So
what about two extended stays at the same time? Is that something that could be done?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, that's also being considered as well. But the problem is that how do you rule out simple telepathy? It's like if we did like a remote viewing test or something like that, we both remote viewed or whatever, some location and got some information back, are we really going to the same place, or is one person being successful and the other person is reading the other's mind? Do you know what I mean? So how do you rule out this just a simple direct connection between two people's minds? And there's much more evidence, statistical evidence for telepathy now, that's been accumulated over 100 years or so. So that would be the first thing you would go to and say, okay, this is a type of telepathy. So how do we rule that out is the question here. How do we eliminate the possibility of simple telepathy? And there might be ways to do that. But again, it would require careful thought about the type of experiment and how that would work. My current thinking, having spoken, and I've spoken about this in other interviews, but spoken to people like Andres Gomez Emilson, who you might know. He's a mathematician. He's very interested in DMT. Probably,
I think I've seen him active on X or Twitter, whatever.
Oh, he's very active on X, yeah. And he's, I would say, the world's leading kind of DMT phenomenologist. I think he understands the mathematical structure and the topological structure, the geometry of the DMT space, probably better than almost anyone on the planet, I would guess, including myself. And he describes entities performing, not giving him information specifically, but performing mathematical feats, mathematical operations that a human brain can't perform. The simplest example, there are several that he gave me, but the simplest one to explain is the four-color theorem, which is a tiling theorem. So if you have a two-dimensional surface with lots of tessellating shapes, you can always color every shape with a different color so that no two shapes of the same color but together with four colors. So it's like if you want to draw a world map, you don't want two countries with the same color, and you only need four colors to do that. Doesn't matter how complicated the pattern is, you can always color it with four colors and no two sides will touch with the same color. But it's a very difficult thing to do. It's a simple idea to understand, but with a very complex map, it's very difficult to color it. Whereas he was describing beings that were generating these maps like within a fraction of a second, like repeatedly. They'd create this incredibly complex map, perfect, four colors, delete it or whatever, and then paint it again with a different one, and again. It's like they can't help but betray their intelligence. So I think I kind of like the idea that we don't go in there kind of probing them, or asking them directly. We don't require their cooperation. We simply go in there and observe them. People go in there who are mathematically sophisticated. I mean, if I went in there and I saw them doing that, I would go, wow, that's amazing. And that would be it. And I would come out and say, oh, they were doing things that were incredible. Boring. But he can come out and say they were doing things that were exquisitely mathematically sophisticated, and I can tell you exactly what they were doing. They were solving the four-color theorem. They were solving this theorem. They were performing this minimization problem. All this mathematical stuff that most people would they might recognize it as being fascinating and beautiful or weird, but being able to send someone in there that can actually tell you exactly why this is impossible. A human brain cannot do this, and if the human brain cannot do this, then how is it possible that I'm seeing it? Because we know the world is being constructed by the brain. That suggests that we're dealing with something external to the brain that is generating that imagery. That is, in my opinion, that is directing the imagery, that is directing the world model being constructed by your brain. But it is some kind of intelligence that is very far beyond the human. So this light shining through, you've got this interesting effect.
Oh, you're fine. You're
trying
fine.
to avoid it, but I can't.
No, you're fine. It's because your explanations are so illuminating.
There we go. Yeah.
But so that I find that interesting in two parts. So like you could go either way on this. I always think of that that little circle where they show all the psilocybin connections of the brain. They show the connections happening in the brain on psilocybin versus not on psilocybin.
Yeah.
Let's say that this does something, DMT does something similar, or going into those states. You're talking about this guy discovering or analyzing these mathematical feats. Maybe it's a tool, and if nothing else, let's say we are communicating with our own subconscious or something deep within ourselves. On one end, you could say, well, then that could be used as a tool maybe to discover, deeper mathematical properties of the universe or whatever. And on the other end of things, maybe it's not. Maybe these are external. I think on both fronts, it opens up doors to discovery, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in some respects, and for some people, they don't care whether it's real or what real even means. I mean, that question is not a simple one. What do we mean by real? All experiences are real in some ways. They're all built from the same stuff. They're all built from these patterns of neural activity generated by the brain. So all experiences are to some extent real. They all occur in consciousness. So does it matter, one might ask, whether we're dealing with something that's outside the brain or inside the brain? And ultimately, we might find that it's kind of a meaningless question, inside and outside. Ultimately, we might find that, if we look at it at a high enough perspective, that actually we're talking about the same thing. So I'm very sympathetic for that position. In which case, sure, we just say, okay, this seems to be potentially, as you say, a tool that could allow us to explore certainly highly unusual states of consciousness, but also highly unusual mathematical structures. I mean, people who, you can imagine a topologist or something, or a geometer, an algebraic topologist or whatever, going into the DMT space and actually being able to experience structures that before he only understood as in the purely abstract. It's impossible, even doesn't matter how good you are as a mathematician, to imagine a 9-dimensional manifold or whatever. I'm just making stuff up here, but you get the point, right? You have these high-dimensional structures that are impossible to imagine or comprehend, and you go into the DMT state and you're confronted with them. And I think that in itself is incredible, and certainly needs to be explored, even if we decide that, well, certain people aren't particularly interested in the so-called the ontology of this thing. I mean, that's a whole different area of exploration, which is far more difficult, I think, to get our teeth into.
My question is there benefits other than like the old adage, like, oh, there's no such thing as kind of like a bad trip, because you can learn something from it. But is there something going on, from the standpoint of something more to these nightmare-like scenarios or positive scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question for a therapist, really, or a psychologist. I think I don't subscribe to the idea that there's no such thing as a bad trip. I think there are. I mean, try and tell people. In the book I described this guy, this Korean guy who was over 3 ayahuasca trips in the Peruvian Amazon. Perfect setting. Everything was absolutely perfect, and he was expecting to see Mother Ayahuasca, and he was confronted with these vicious insectoid alien beings who tortured him and captured his soul. And try telling him that that wasn't a bad trip. There may be some. I'm not saying wasn't some deeper message here, and that it wasn't purely malicious. Maybe they were trying to teach him something. But he certainly didn't come out of the experience with that. It wasn't like a journey where he was. It wasn't like the kind of the hero's journey where he descended to the underworld and had these horrible experiences, and then he reached a moment of enlightenment when he realized, it's all illusion or whatever, and he came out a bigger man than when he went in. For him it was pure torture. I mean, he came out of it, he was horrified, and that's why he contacted me, because he was terrified that they captured his soul, and that when he died he was going to be taken back to that place, eternally, perhaps. I mean, this was a horrifying thought. I mean, many people have entertained the idea of, what happens after you die? What if you go to hell? But having been there, it must be a horrifying thought. The idea that he might be headed back there. So, I mean, I did my best to assuage him and to convince him that this wasn't the case, and that there probably was some deeper message and some lesson there that he hadn't found yet. But at the same time, I wasn't going to say, oh, you need to get back on the horse, my friend, and go back to the Amazon and drink more ayahuasca, because I might be setting him up for, even worse. So one has to tread carefully with offering advice to people and saying there's no such thing as bad trips, because for some people there really are such things as bad trips, and people have, it's rare, but people do have sometimes long-lasting negative experiences. So I'm not averse to the idea of, I don't think anyone in their right mind is averse to the idea of not eliminating necessarily, but minimizing the possibility of bad trips and getting the setting right. I'm also not adverse to the idea of, taking MDMA prior to, psilocybin for certain people. The candy flipping. Is it candy flipping, or is that LSD and MDMA? I always
it's hippie flipping. Yeah,
that's hippie flipping. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway,
great combo, by the way. Fabulous.
Great combo, right? And that's been. I remember reading a paper just a few years ago where they tried this technique. They studied it in a research setting and found that it, as we kind of understood anyway, but found that yes, it reduces the occurrence of negative experiences. And I'm not averse to this. I kind of don't have much time for people who are always going on about, oh, you need to face your shadow and stuff. I mean, that's fine if you want to face your shadow, my friend, but some people just want to have a beautiful, mind expanding, pleasant experience, and that shouldn't be denied them. This idea that you have to go through bad trips, I don't think is but they are, obviously, it's unpredictable. You can never eliminate the possibility entirely, and one should know how to deal with them. But yeah, is it a bad trip? is it a learning trip? I think you can frame it in both ways. But yeah, that's as much as I can say, I think, about
To that anecdote, what I find interesting is I wonder if that guy was scared of insects, because so that's actually not that uncommon. I've heard troop reports. I know actually the late great Jerry Garcia, and actually the Grateful Dead got their name from a DMT experience, but there's a anecdote where Jerry Garcia is doing this interview and he's talking about smoking DMT, and he talks about our insectoid overlords and these mantis-like beings, and he, it's actually kind of a crazy interview. I recommend people go try and find that on the internet if you can. I'll try and find the link if I can too. I think it's all typed out. It's not like recorded or anything, but I just wonder how much fear of certain things also play into it too. This is like somebody that's scared of an insect, but that maybe another person isn't. They might have different experiences.
Yeah, I think if we are dealing with some kind of intelligence, it wouldn't surprise me if they take some pleasure in for want of a better term, kind of fucking with us a little bit. It does perhaps suggest that if you do have deep-seated issues with certain things, whether it is insects or spiders, or they might take advantage of that, or whether it's your subconscious kind of trying to
I've heard that too. I've heard people that have like insecurities of some sort being that kind of like the entities throwing that back in their face kind of a thing, or like you said, kind of just messing with them or whatever, which is kind of crazy, which that's definitely part of the trickster element though too, right? Idea that it's,
I was just going to say,
yeah,
DMT is tricksy. It's a tricksy molecule that you should be very careful about what you take from what they say, what they do, or the messages that they give you. I think that you can be led down the garden path again by these beings, and I won't talk about specific examples recently, but I think there are certain cases that have become quite well known where people, I get the feeling that people might be being led down the garden path by entities. I'll say no more than that. People might know what I'm referring to, others might not. You don't, maybe.
Well, yeah, we'll get to some other stuff here in a minute. I want to just finish. I have a few more questions that I thought out before we get to this new segment I've been doing. But so in the later chapters, you suggest DMT isn't just generating hallucinations, but it also might be tuning their consciousness into an actual ontological domain. From your perspective, both a neuroscientist and a theorist, what would you count as a convincing evidence that these realms are real, and that the brain is, and they're not just brain-generated illusions? I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but like, what is the best evidence that you think you have for these realms being real, if you will?
Well, I mean, the kind of the second third of the book is devoted to that question, really, is why can't we just say they're hallucinations? Why can't we just say this is exotic dream imagery or whatever? And that's really been my approach, is to say, okay, these DMT visions, just like all subjective experiences, are constructed in some way by the brain. This is your kind of your foundational starting point. Then the question is, well, is the brain constructing these entirely without any kind of help, with any kind of external sensory inputs? Now, to answer that question, you need to distinguish between the kinds of world models that your brain can construct and those that it can't. And that requires an analysis of how the world is built by the brain and its limitations. What are the limitations, and what evidence do we have from subjective experience, from dream states, from hallucinations. We know that the brain evolved to construct a model of the world as a model of the environment, and it has its limits. In the dream state, for example, the dream state tends to be, for the most part, indistinguishable. Studies have been showing this for 100 years, that the dream state is generally continuous with waking. The brain is using what it's learned about constructing the world in the waking state to construct the world in the dream state. People dream about dogs and cats. They dream about cows and horses if they work on a farm. If they like fishing, they might dream about fishes. If they live in the Amazon rainforest, they might dream of piranha and anaconda and panther. So the dream state is a model. This is the only world your brain knows how to build, is how I normally put it, which is the world as a model of the environment. It doesn't know, or shouldn't know, in my opinion, how to construct exquisitely complex, staggeringly complex alternate worlds that have no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. And that is what the DMT world represents. It's a world that is it's disjoint, I would say, from the normal waking world. It is not just random neural firing. It is a world that is exceedingly coherent, staggering narrative complexity. It is a world that doesn't bear any relationship to the normal waking world, and to me that is a great mystery. And I think that suggests, in my opinion, that there is some directing of this world. I don't think that you're going to another space. I don't think you're seeing another world as such, or going to another world. I think there is some kind of intelligent agent that is directing what you see. I don't know whether that intelligent agent is singular or there's a multiplicity, or whether it could be faithfully represented in any kind of visual form. I don't know, but I think it's directing the visions, and there's evidence from that, from a quite widespread effect, which I discuss in the book, often called Lockout, which is when the beings not only are able to direct the visions, but are actually able to kind of direct entry into the space and control entry into the space. So people who will use DMT often for long periods have full breakthrough experiences every time, using it weekly or sometimes daily, and then suddenly they get a message. They get a big flashing X that blasts into their brain, and they get some kind of entity wagging its finger at them. One person described getting punched by some jester-like being and being instantaneously brought back to normal waking consciousness. So this is, to me, a pharmacological mystery. It's not tolerance. Tolerance develops slowly and gradually over time. It's not an off switch. It seems to be that that the DMT state is being directed by a flow of information into the brain, when the brain is in this much more fluid and dynamic state, induced by DMT. And this intelligence, of course, if they can control the flow of information into the brain, they can also cut off that flow of information. And that is what this lockout represents, in my opinion. Often it's people who use it too much, abuse it, one would say, or aren't using it with good intention. But that's not a tolerance effect, even though it's often described as such. The same batch of DMT, the same vaporization method, everything's the same, except one day they get a message that's saying no entry, and sometimes this lasts for months. They try again a few weeks later, they're still locked out, and then they have to kind of do some work, and eventually maybe they get allowed back in. The effects return. But this, to me, is aside from this mathematical operations that I was describing, that Andres Gomez Emilson was describing to me, this lockout effect is truly fascinating, because it really kind of backs up this idea that the DMT state is being directed. The DMT state is, I call it a directed world. You don't break through into the DMT world. The DMT world breaks through into you. It's just this flow of information coming into the brain that's directing the visions. And if that is cut off, then you are denied entry, no matter how much DMT you smoke. So that, I think those things, to me, aside from the broader properties of the DMT space, which I discuss at length, the unlikely, how unlikely it is that the brain can construct these worlds in the absence of some data, external data inputs. I think these specific cases, really are good targets for us to study, and I'd like to see a study of Lockout. It's very difficult to study it, in a lab, because you can't. It's kind of unpredictable unless you have someone who is currently locked out, and then bring them into the research laboratory and inject them with DMT and ask them about their experiences. And if they have no experience, then, well, this is, with pure, IV DMT, if they're not getting any effects from the drug, I think that would be very cool to demonstrate. That someone who had used DMT in the past, who'd had many experiences in the past that were documented in some way, so we knew that these people were normally perfectly responsive to DMT. We get an idea of, their usage over time, and then we bring them into the research institution or laboratory or whatever, inject them with DMT, and then if they have no response, you can even look at their neural activity. That would be cool to put them in an MRI machine and actually see what's going on in the brain when someone is locked out. What's different about the way that the information flows through the brain. I think that would be a really cool study to do. If anyone wants to do it, maybe we'll do it. I don't know.
Come on, guys, get on it. Guys and gals, get out there. I think it's chapter 15, the intelligence. In the intelligence, you flirt with the idea of a mind-like principle underlying reality. Do you think DMT is revealing that consciousness is primary and matter emerges from it? Or do you think that we'll still see a path for these experiences from a bottom-up materialist framework kind of a thing?
Well, I don't think we're going to get an answer, a solution. I don't think we're ever going to derive consciousness in a bottom-up fashion from matter. I think consciousness is fundamental. That doesn't mean that studying the brain and how psychedelics work in the brain isn't useful, because the brain clearly is. If consciousness is fundamental, the brain is a highly complex pattern of consciousness fundamentally. That's how really I see it. I see the brain as a complex emergence pattern within consciousness. I think consciousness is absolutely fundamental. So what was the I don't know.
What do you do you think? What do you think is fundamental in the universe? Do you think that consciousness is primary, or do you think that matter is primary? Okay.
I think that consciousness is primary, and I think the problem we've had over the last several hundred years is assuming matter to be primary, and then basically struggling for the next 400 years or whatever, since Descartes, really, probably earlier, to try and derive consciousness from matter. With taking that as an axiom, the kind of the fundamental axiom that we've been working on is that matter is fundamental, whatever matter is, and then consciousness emerges at certain higher levels of organization of matter, certain levels of complexity are reached, and you get consciousness. And it's not worked so far, and my guess is that it's not worked because it's not going to work. I think even in principle, the idea of deriving subjective experience from matter, I think is doomed to fail. And more scientists now, it's not just kind of woo-woo mystical types, but serious scientists. Tononi is kind of one, Christoph Koch, and others, Tegmark to an extent, consider consciousness to be fundamental, and that yes, we need to work in the opposite direction, basically, and work out, how does consciousness behave, and how does consciousness complexify and self-organize to form these structures. But fundamentally, it's all about, everything's subjective. Ultimately, I think subjectivity, consciousness, which means That's what we mean by consciousness, right? It's subjective. That subjective experience is consciousness, and it can be very, pure consciousness, the pure bright what light of pure awareness, that would be consciousness. Or it could be this extremely complex world that we exist in now, normal waking subjective world. Or it could be the DMT world, which is inordinately more complex, but is still an experience within consciousness. So yes, that my answer is yes. I think consciousness is fundamental.
Awesome. I have one more question, and then we'll get to Mike's mind melters. You describe DMT as a future technology of astonishment. If humanity develops the extended state or a reproducible DMT technology, do you see primarily as a scientific tool for mapping hidden dimensions? We talked about like topography and things like that, but do you think that it will be more of a scientific application or some sort of spiritual initiation device? Like, what do you think the future holds for that?
Well, both. I think there comes a point when the spiritual and the scientific start to merge. I don't think they are as distant and disconnected as we once assumed. If consciousness is absolutely fundamental, then DMT is a tool for exploring consciousness, and is a tool for exploring other types of consciousness and other types of consciousnesses, or other perspectives, or other beings that also exist within consciousness. And that sounds very spiritual to me. The idea of communicating with normally invisible, discarnate, intelligent beings, that feels like a very spiritual thing. Whereas at the same time, I talk in very scientific terms, and I talk about DMT infusion, extended state infusion technologies, and and neural activity, and pharmacological tool. This is all very scientific, and yet it feels like the aim is ultimately spiritual in some way. So I think the word spiritual starts to lose its meaning in a way. I guess I struggle to give you a precise definition, of what do you mean by spiritual. It doesn't seem to mean necessarily,
I guess something
spirit.
beyond. I mean, because I think a lot of people perceive stuff that's spiritual. I mean, you could look at it as just metaphysics, right? Just stuff that we haven't really figured out yet. But there's some element that feels spiritual or feels beyond, reality, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you might say something that exists beyond the physical, which is, basically my fundamental perspective is that the physical emerges ultimately from consciousness. So yeah, it's kind of tricky, but I think the idea of interacting with beings that are non-physical, or that are normally hidden, I could, 100 years ago, I would be calling them spirits, I guess. And that obviously would be a spiritual perspective. So yeah, I think both scientific and spiritual.
All right. Are you ready to enter Mike's mind melters?
I'm not sure, but
let's give it a whirl. All right, Andrew. I'm going to ask you 5 philosophical questions. Just please answer them the best you can, and we'll go from there. Number 1. What is something you believe in that you know is probably wrong or illogical, but you are just not being honest with yourself?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. What is something I believe in that I think is probably wrong? Well, I'm gonna give you the boring answer, in that I would hope that if I believed in something which I thought was probably wrong, I would stop believing in it. But
We both know that that's
I
not
don't
how it
know. I
works.
think generally I'm very open to beliefs. I'm very open to possibilities. So yeah, I can't answer that question. I can't think of anything. That I
Okay.
believe in that I think is probably wrong.
An example would be somebody that's maybe they're like Christian, but they're like, yeah, maybe this God thing, not, something along those
Yeah, I mean,
lines.
right. If you were asking me about what other people believe in that they know is probably wrong, I can give you some really politically incorrect answers, but I'm not going to, because there are better hills to die on. Yeah, I try to avoid getting myself into those kind of belief systems. But I know there are a lot of people in the world that certainly kind of believe things
The root of the question is actually
that
just to be honest with yourself about some sort of like hidden cognitive bias that you have that maybe you aren't aware of. But we can move on. You kind of gave me your thoughts on it, which is good enough for me. Number
All right.
2, do you think there is an objective purpose for humanity, and if so, what?
Yes and no. I think I subscribe to the idea. I mean, this really comes from someone like Alan Watts. The idea that reality is ultimately play, and that's kind of the point of it, rather than some kind of grand aim. I don't kind of like that idea necessarily that there is some ultimate purpose that's big and important, because I think the idea that ultimately it's all about it's all one big drama. Reality is a grand drama, and of course Watts got all of this from Hinduism, really. Ancient Hindu ideas, from Vedanta and Advaita and stuff. And so I think, yeah, that resonates with me. I don't think that reality is serious, and I think you get that message a lot on DMT. If you take it too seriously, then you will often pay the price and you will get mocked for it. So yeah, that's my feeling. Is reality itself is one big cosmic drama, cosmic game, perhaps even cosmic joke.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I think the common out is usually we create our own purpose or telos or whatever. But yeah, to your point, I think that I like Alan Watts. I listen to Alan Watts a lot too. I think that he offers a lot there. So that's a good answer. Number 3. Do you think humans are special or separate from the rest of nature? If your answer is yes, please give your best example of why.
I mean, again, I think we are clearly special in some ways. I mean, this is, cognitively, technologically, we have in many ways we are clearly different from other animals. But at the same time, there are also animals that seem to be much happier than us. Dolphins, for example, who are also very intelligent, who also possess language, and seem to have a great time, more so than we do. I think our problem, in many ways, our specialness or uniqueness comes with many problems, which again goes back to the last question of taking ourselves too seriously and taking life too seriously and treating it like some journey with some really important goal at the end. And that leads to a lot of the suffering and the grasping and the accumulation, and all of that stuff. So yes, in some ways we're special. Is that the right word? I'm not sure. But then I think other animals are also special in their own way. That they're
It's
not
a rabbit
Dolphins
hole. You'd be very hard pressed
It's a
to find.
rabbit hole.
You'd be very hard pressed to
Yeah.
find something that there's no proto version of what we're capable of. I think for me, this is something I ask myself a lot, and I think that maybe recursion or recursive tool making. You know, we make things that make things, where, I mean, you might be able to make the argument that maybe primates are making tools, you know, but then we're so far removed from that initial phase that it's very different.
Yes, I guess it hinges on what you mean by special. I mean, unique, more advanced, more sophisticated, more intelligent, all of these stuff definitely apply. Special is an interesting word, which you chose deliberately, I know. But
That's why these are the mind melters, bro. Number 4, what do you think happens when we die?
oh, um, so what I don't think that necessarily, I don't know is the answer, but obviously, but I don't think we're going necessarily, I don't subscribe to the idea that we're going to take everything with us and take our identity, you know, who we are, our name and our occupation and our interests and our personality with us. The idea perhaps that the consciousness is in some way continuous, that nobody's ever born, nobody ever dies. Again, this goes back to the idea of consciousness being fundamental, is that there is no such thing as birth and there is no such thing as death, ultimately. There's a great Zen, actually, a great quote that I used in Reality Switch. There we go, chance to plug, where I said, here we go. When I took my first breath, my world was born with me. When I die, my world dies with me. In other words, I wasn't born into a world that was already here before me. I bring my own world into existence, live it out, and take it with me when I die. So it suggests this idea of that you have your own world now. When you die, you know, from your perspective, you kind of have another world. I don't know. You know, that this is a kind of a continuous process. You're not born, you don't come into the world, you kind of bring your world with you. It's kind of pretty deep stuff, but yeah, that's kind of what I don't think that it's a you know, when you die, you die. You know, that's it. I don't think that's the case from other people's perspective.
Last question for Mike's Mind Melters. What do you think is the greatest mystery of all time, and why?
The greatest mystery of all time. Again, not a particularly imaginative example, but I guess, again, going back to Alan Watts, he often used to talk about the idea of that existence is weird. Just the fact that things exist is really odd. It would have been much simpler if there was literally nothing. Not just nothing as in, you know, quantum foam, or, you know, not Lawrence Krauss's idea of nothing, but like like nothing.
Does anybody
nothing,
like
nothing.
that
Absolutely.
idea? I've never met anybody that liked Lawrence Krauss's idea of nothing.
No. But I mean, it's the best that he could do, right? It was to go. He called it nothing because, you know, a universe from nothing is a great title for a book. But I think anyone that was intellectually honest would know that he's not talking about nothing here. So yeah, so the idea of absolute, you know, why isn't that absolute? And I've often wondered about this. And when your consciousness, your brain kind of locks into the idea, it sends a little shiver, like what absolute nothing. There's never been anything and never will be, and its existence itself does not exist. I mean, that is the simplest, purest state. But that's not the state, clearly. So yeah, the great mystery, you know, what's this all about? Why, what is this thing? What is reality? I don't think we're even close to grasping that. And I guess this is what the Zen Buddhists do, you know, in the mountains here in Japan. And they sit and face a wall and try and kind of observe that directly, because I don't think you're going to reach an answer to that question intellectually. You kind of have to sit for 20 years and hope that it hits you or it strikes you. It's a personal revelation, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you for answering those. I know they're tough. I put you on the spot. Nobody knows what the questions are going in. It's not like I gave you the list and said we're going to talk about this. But that's what makes them tough. And I think part of those why I created these questions is, number one, to put somebody on the spot, and number two, I think that it confronts you with questions that we all kind of avoid regularly, but that I think are essential to being a human being. But I appreciate you answering those. Is there an ancient psychedelic tradition there in Japan of any sort with like mushrooms or anything? Or
well, there's a modern psychedelic tradition for sure. It's a good question. I mean, it's something I'd like to actually study more seriously. There are many species of psychedelic mushroom in Japan. Whether there's a history of use is a good question. The answer is I don't know. I'd like to know. Yeah, but certainly in the modern era, there's ayahuasca circles and things like that, and there's certainly a psychedelic subculture in Japan.
Is there naturally growing? I mean, there's mushrooms that grow everywhere, but what species? Do you know? Is there any species that grow around there?
I couldn't give you the species by name, but yeah, there are. Well, I say many. I say a handful of mushrooms that grow, throughout, from mainland Japan, Honshu, and down to Okinawa. There's a species of mushroom that grows only in Okinawa. So yeah, I mean, there's certainly lots of psychedelics around. Acacia confusa grows in Okinawa, lots of it, and in neighboring Taiwan actually. But yeah, there's certainly plenty of it around. But how much, how far back, I don't know, but that's something I'd like to research.
Yeah, and Asian entheogenic traditions are kind of a mystery to me. I don't really know. There's not really anybody talking about them, at least to a popular standpoint. Maybe it's esoteric, or maybe you'll find some, like you said, some old monk or Buddhist or something that might have some knowledge. But
right, that would have to brush up on my kind of old Japanese, which is, I mean, modern Japanese is tough enough, but going back to the old books, certainly handwritten, I mean, it's like no chance.
Have you heard about this not new, but I think the student found the psychedelic component of Morning Glory? Are you familiar with this? It's kind of going around. I can pull up the name.
Yeah, so I mean, what he found was the symbiotic fungus.
Yeah, that's right, the fungus. Yeah.
Within the seeds. Yeah, I mean, this was the reason it was kind of a big result was because it was the same species that Hoffman originally isolated LSA from. But there are a number of Morning Glory species that with symbiotic fungi that had been isolated before that produce produce these lysergic acids.
Hawaiian baby, wood rose, that kind of stuff.
Right, exactly. So it's not an entirely new. I think we knew for a long time, or suspected, that there was that it wasn't the Morning Glory plant, the actual seeds themselves, that were producing these LSA, because they're very, they're complex molecular structures. But it's probably a fungus. As is often
it's always
the case,
the fungus.
It's always the fucking fungi, right? Yeah.
All right, last question. I promise we'll get you out of here. I've been kind of following a little bit. I was during my hiatus. I started a different channel, a philosophy channel, but I've been following your interactions with, was it Danny Goler? And this idea of, he smokes DMT and then, looks into the laser and sees some sort of code and, thinks that we're in a simulation, or that's the hypothesis that he's put forth. And you've had a little bit of a back and forth with him. Where do you stand on all that? Yeah.
Where do I stand? I stand that it's minimally a very interesting phenomenon in that it allows you to fairly reliably isolate a particular aspect of the broader DMT phenomenology. Minimally, it's worth of study for that. But this is a simulation, and this is the fundamental source code I don't buy. Again, for reasons that I've discussed at length. In many places, I've got an article on my Substack why I don't subscribe to that, and of course, why would I? I mean, there's a lot of work, scientific work, that needs to occur before you to bring this out of the realm of private revelation. You see the code and you're convinced this is a source code. Okay, great. Now you need to bring this outside of private revelation and into actual scientific observations and analyses. And
is anybody looking to do that?
Well, I think Danny is having a go. When I was out in LA just a couple of months ago, we had a few long conversations about this. There's a movie coming out, a documentary called The Discovery, I think next year, which has got my conversations, my interviews and stuff, as well as the whole thing. I think it's fascinating, but I'm certainly not ready to accept that he's stumbled upon the source code. I mean, that's a huge thing to say. And there are a number of issues with that hypothesis, in my opinion, in terms of what the code looks like, and why there would be a code that was human readable as code if it was a fundamental source code, why it would be running through reality like the Matrix, the unfortunate coincidence that a laser light, when reflected off a surface, tends to produce this pattern of speckles, this interference pattern on the retina, these points of sensory inputs, around which imagery can certainly be seeded, which could give could act as like a sensory scaffold for complex imagery generated by DMT. The fact that this speckle pattern has a number of optical properties that make it appear as if it occupies space behind the wall. This is all without DMT. So all these things are they make you think that maybe there's some interaction between the optical properties of the laser and the DMT that's generating this effect, rather than you're seeing the source code of reality. And distinguishing between those is no easy task, but that's what you need to do. I'm accused of being a hater or dismissing it or ruling it out. I'm not. I'm just saying, as I do with everything, you go for more mundane explanations first, and then you try to rule them out. And once you've ruled them out, then you start reaching for more exotic explanations. And the idea that we've discovered the source code of reality is about as exotic an explanation as you get. It doesn't get any grander than that. So I can understand why people are kind of latching onto this and going, "Oh my God, this is like most important discovery in the history of mankind." And if it was true, then it would be. But there's a long way to go from an observation under the influence of DMT with this laser, knowing what we know about the optical effects and properties of lasers and other things, and reaching that grandest of conclusions. So that's all I'm saying is just, and of course, we were talking about the ideas of these intelligences fucking with you. So what better way to fuck with someone than to convince them that they're being shown the ultimate source code of reality?
Yeah, I don't think people
have to be very careful.
And I've talked to people about this, but like you see something. Let's say you're having an experience and you're watching TV. If you then close your eyes, you're gonna see that TV there for a while, and so forth with a lot of things, right? So like, I'm not saying that but just the idea of that's the way our brain works. So it could be holding on to symbols or letters or whatever, and then our brain could be kind of, in that state, putting things together that maybe are not actually there. I don't know.
The brain is very good at constructing symbols. I mean, we are a literary species, a lexical species, and our brain is very good. Reading requires your brain to construct, at a high rate, a series of very small, finely detailed symbols. This is what reading is. So your brain is very, very good at that. which is why lexical hallucinations of text, of code, of mathematical symbols, of musical notation, they occur in about, I think it's about 40% of cases of visual hallucinations in people with various neuropsychological, hallucinatory disorders. Lots of people seeing code and letters, it's one of the most common forms of hallucination. And seeing code under the influence of DMT is also common, that goes back decades. So how do we distinguish between that? How do we say that? How do we confirm this is not just a type of lexical hallucination, highly complex, fascinating form, but DMT does generate very complex and interesting imagery? How do we distinguish between that and the code of reality? That's not an easy thing to do.
It sounds like there's a show called Devs that was on for a while where they figured out the algorithm for prediction of everything of life. It kind of reminds me of that a little bit. But yeah, look, we're human beings. We've got apophenia and pareidolia, and our mind likes to put things together and patterns and pattern recognition. That's what we do, right? So I'm interested in it. I'll see, what happens. I'm looking forward to checking this documentary when it comes out. And, I did read your Substack when you were having that back and forth. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there. If nothing else, it's a cool thought experiment, right? Or just a way to look at this phenomenon.
Yeah, I think so. Minimally, it's fascinating. That you can reliably, as I say, isolate this particular aspect of DMT. That's cool, and it could be a very cool tool. If you can imagine expanding this laser to kind of replicate the optical pattern generated by the laser, but on a screen or something. That would be cool. So someone could view the screen with this very specific pattern of light that would allow them to see code-like imagery, and explore the nature of that code. I can see lots of cool things coming from it, but I'm certainly not ready to go to the most far out conclusions just yet.
Well, Andrew, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much. Thank you for being interested in these topics and sharing your knowledge. And Death by Astonishment's a great book. I highly recommend it. If anybody's interested in the history, or I should say the non-Indigenous history of ayahuasca and DMT, please check it out, because there's a lot of great information. And I consider myself somebody that knows a lot about this topic, and even I learned a lot, especially the William Burroughs stuff. I thought was super fascinating. I was unaware of all of that pretty much. I had heard of Shultes and, all that stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of great information in there. I learned a lot, and it's going to be interesting to see where we go from here. Is there anything you've got coming up, or is it just back to the grindstone, writing another book? What's your next move here?
I've got something very big coming up, but I'll say no more. And then it's back to the grindstone for a new book.
All right. Well, I love both of those things. I'll have to have you back on when one of those things pops. I'll be paying attention, as always. But I really appreciate it, for real. And you're very generous with your time, and you're an open book, as they say. And I appreciate you being a good sport about the Mike's Mind Melters. And yeah, man, that's it. That's all I got.
All right.
Well, thank you as always. And the way we will end this is the way we end all of our Mind Escape episodes, which is we love everybody. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace. If you would like to support Mind Escape, there's many ways you can do it, but the best way to do it is to click the LinkTree link down below. I have everything from merch to our Patreon page. Our Patreon, by the way, I archived a lot of the Mind Escape 1.0 episodes on there. There is still some available on our YouTube channel and our Spotify and Apple Podcast. However, like I said, if you're looking for a specific older episode, it might be on our Patreon, which has been archived, and it's $2 a month. And there's also exclusive content on there as well that was never released to any other platform. So please go check that out. You can also check out our documentary that Maurice and I made a few years ago called As Within, So Without, from from UFOs to DMT. That is available on there as well. There's also a director's cut. Please click the subscribe button and follow us. And if you're listening on an audio platform like Spotify, we do have video on Spotify as well. And please leave us a nice review. We would really appreciate that.